The subcommittee will come to order. I now call up panel 2. Since your written testimony has been made a part of the record, the committee will request that you limit your oral testimony to 5 minutes. Hear from Mr. Flynn for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Chairman Payne, Chairman DeFazio, Ranking Member Crawford, and members of the subcommittee. I'm proud to represent Amtrak's 17,000 hardworking employees and have the opportunity to discuss Amtrak's critical role in advancing high-speed rail in America. As America's only high-speed rail operator, Amtrak strongly supports development of high-speed rail in all markets where it makes sense. This includes in the Northeast Corridor, the NEC, where we stand ready to advance President Biden's vision of making our existing high-speed service much faster, and in new or existing markets which have the population levels and other attributes that make such services successful. Building high-speed rail and expanding overall intercity passenger operations require a strong federal commitment and substantial and reliable federal funding through a trust fund-like structure. This is the most important lesson we can learn from countries with successful high-speed networks. There's simply no substitute. If we funded highways the same way we funded intercity passenger rail to date, we'd still be driving on dirt roads. High-speed rail must be part of a much broader rail strategy. Our goal shouldn't be to develop high-speed rail lines in only a few corridors which take years to yield benefits. We should develop a modern, efficient, trip time competitive intercity passenger rail network that includes high-speed rail. Every high-speed system in the world relies on a foundation of high-quality, conventional intercity rail that allows passengers to connect to high-speed services. The development of such systems has generally been undertaken by the nationally owned railroad to ensure effective service integration, economies of scale, and uniform standards. Amtrak is well suited for the job, created with the legal authority and having the fleet, the core systems, the trained employees, and the experience necessary for the job. We are transforming the Northeast Corridor into North America's only 160-mile-per-hour operation. And given that high-speed rail lines take many years to develop and construct, an average of 16 years according to a 2018 European Commission study, we should start right away by continuing to develop the NEC and initiating conventional and higher speed services in the many corridors that we've identified for improvement or expansion in our recently released Amtrak Connects Us vision. For some of the 60 corridors that we've identified, high-speed service should be the ultimate goal, such as corridors in Texas, Florida, and the Pacific Northwest. Many other corridors have opportunities to achieve 110 or 125 miles per hour in the near term, such as the Richmond to Raleigh segment of the Southeast high-speed rail corridor. Pursuing such a strategy will give us a realistic, achievable, scalable plan for a network of expanded intercity and high-speed passenger rail service throughout our nation. Our Northeast Corridor operations demonstrate the success of this model. Our Acela service dominates in certain segments, such as Washington to New York. Years of investment have improved all levels of service and allowed high-speed trains to benefit from the connectivity and access provided by regular intercity and commuter trains. With additional investments, we can deliver much faster service, generating enormous economic benefits. With funding to replace ancient infrastructure on the NEC, such as the 148-year-old 30 miles per hour BMP tunnel south of Baltimore, and additional investments costing less than $50 billion, Amtrak could significantly reduce trip times. For example, a trip between Washington and New York City would take only 2 hours. Washington to Baltimore would take just 21 minutes. Investments like these would create thousands of jobs, enable faster and more frequent commuter rail service, and contribute directly to the fight against climate change. Taking an Amtrak train on the all-electric NEC produces 83% fewer greenhouse gas emissions than driving, and 73% fewer than flying. Our nation needs a comprehensive network of high-quality intercity passenger rail service that includes high-speed rail. And Amtrak's ready to deliver that. deliver that in partnership with the federal government, states, and private entities such as Texas Central and Brightline. If intercity rail is going to meaningfully contribute to the president's goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2030 and help create the expanded mobility, greater economic opportunity, and enhanced equity we desire, we need a broad program anchored by a federal commitment and dedicated funding. Thank you for your time and your support, and I look forward to your questions.
And now we have Mr. Reininger for 5 minutes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, ranking member, members of the subcommittee. I'm honored to be here again, having last testified before you 4 years ago. Brightline was under construction, and some of the same topics were on the table. Since our 2018 launch in Florida, we operate the only private high-speed system in the U.S. showcasing the potential of American high-speed passenger rail. We carried more than 1 million passengers in our first full year and learned a lot that is worth sharing from the investment of over $4 billion over the last 10 years. From the perspective of our experience, we see multiple opportunities to again break free from the inertia that has historically restrained high-speed rail in the U.S. Along with the current discussion around the potential of high-speed rail, we also hear the voices lamenting the lack of advanced train systems that exist in many competing global economies. We see immediate ways to forge meaningful progress towards realizing the potential we are discussing and encourage this committee to enlist the private sector to multiply the effects of public sector investments. We have developed an approach which applies American ingenuity to the successful models observed from around the world. We carefully select travel markets that are too short to fly and too far to drive, and where introducing passenger rail presents a clear consumer value proposition. Changing current habits requires offering a better option. We use existing road alignments and infrastructure corridors to leverage previous investments, reduce environmental impacts, lower costs, and speed execution as a basis for profitability. We continue to build every day, and in 2022, we will complete the extension into the Orlando International Airport, making our total route 235 miles, linking 4 of the largest cities in America's 3rd largest state. 400 million annual trips occur between these cities today, 95% of them by car. By upgrading a freight railway first built in the 1890s and building along an express highway, we leveraged 130 years of previous investment to support our 21st century service. Brightline is on track to carry 9 million annual riders. Brightline West will connect Las Vegas to Los Angeles, where today 50 million annual trips and over 100 daily flights occur. Traveling on trains capable of speeds of 200 miles an hour, using the I-15 corridor, but cutting the drive time in half, Brightline West's better option expects to serve 11 million annual riders. We integrate with other systems to fashion a multimodal network that is diverse and convenient. Miami Central connects all local transit systems with ride sharing, bike sharing, and even e-scooters to connect our customers to their ultimate destinations. Integration requires interagency investment and innovation, but also offers real opportunity to enhance the appeal of train travel in America. Cooperation is key to advancing priorities related to jobs, climate, and equity, so the many benefits that accrue from the introduction of high-speed rail are unlocked. Revitalizing Miami's Overtown neighborhood, equitable access to transportation, and new employment opportunities are just a few of the benefits, in addition to the $6.4 billion in total economic impact Brightline has already produced in Florida. As this subcommittee looks to exact results, especially through increased public investment, we urge you not to consolidate around a single approach and not to underestimate the power private investment can bring towards crafting a national network. Consider allowing private entities to become eligible parties for FRA grant programs by partnering with currently eligible applicants as a simple way to stretch direct government investment. High-speed rail projects require large upfront investments and need cost-efficient, long-term financing. Private activity bonds helped us attract private lenders and freed up capital to be redirected into building our hard assets. Consider increasing the volume cap on PABs from the current $15 billion, which has already been exhausted, to $30 billion to create a larger pool to help finance projects. An improvement, but PABs alone is not the full solution. RIF was designed as a low-interest loan in lieu of grants to incent projects that need an economic boost. We vigorously pursued RIF, but ultimately found it ineffective for projects such as ours. RIF has only provided $6.2 billion in project funding over the last 2 decades, none of which has gone to high-speed rail. Why? These projects get laden with high upfront credit risk premiums, adding inertia that defeats the momentum otherwise gathered from a low-interest loan. If credit risk premiums were an eligible use of US DOT discretionary grant programs, much smaller grants used in conjunction with a loan would ultimately return principal and interest to the government, engage equity investment into the collateral, and lower the overall level of public investment needed to exact results. We commend the efforts of this subcommittee and believe our collective efforts can advance us towards an American high-speed rail system that will compete against the best in the world. And as an active participant, we remain fully committed to overcoming inertia and building more systems we can all ride within the next 4 years. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much for your testimony. We will now move on to member questions. Each member will be recognized for 5 minutes, and I will start by recognizing myself. Mr. Flynn, I know the Amtrak currently operates its Acela high-speed rail service on the Northeast Corridor, which was the way I got here last night. The Acela service helps to transport many of my constituents up and down the Northeast Corridor. I look forward to clearing out the infrastructure backlog on the Northeast Corridor, including the Gateway program, so that Acela trains can travel at the entire full speed along the entire corridor. Can you elaborate more on where you see the Acela service and Amtrak service in general fitting in with high-speed rail?
Thank you for your question, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for riding the Acela down here to Washington the other evening. And I know many members in the North are. As I mentioned in my comments earlier, we do operate high-speed rail. That high-speed rail is the Acela. And the constraints that we have near term in terms of increasing speed and reliability isn't true. A former CEO of Amtrak used to say that the way to go faster is to not go slow. And so to increase speeds in the near term on our right-of-way, on our alignment, we have a substantial state of good repair backlog in track infrastructure, and as you know, certainly with tunnels and bridges along that right-of-way, which is why I called attention to the Baltimore Potomac Tunnel, which has an operating speed right now of 30 miles an hour. So we're operating the Washington to New York segment at an average speed of 80 miles an hour today. We can achieve top speeds of 135 miles an hour. But with improvements such that I've suggested earlier, we believe we can get the Washington to New York segment up to or down to 2 hours, a savings of 50 minutes or so, operating at an average speed of call that 113 miles an hour, for example. And on the north end of our Northeast Corridor, we can make substantial improvement in our New York to Boston route, which is currently at about 3 hours and 40 minutes, and get that down more than an hour to 2 hours and 28 minutes with state of good repair investments and ultimately the investments that are required in the infrastructure.
And now recognize Mr. Crawford for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. I'm going to start with Mr. Flynn. Amtrak announced plans to expand its routes, including to several small cities where there doesn't appear to be enough demand or population to warrant those new lines. Can you guarantee that those new routes will be self-sustaining and turn a profit, or will they lose money?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Crawford. So we announced a vision, Amtrak Connects Us, which talks about expansion of existing lines and service to new areas, about 60 routes therein. The other key point that we mentioned there, Congressman, was that we would open these routes, initiate either new service or expanded service in consultation with the states and with the other authorities, be they municipal authorities, departments of transportation, et cetera. So that vision is indicative. We had a great meeting and press roundtable with representatives from the state of Colorado and Oklahoma just the other day, really a few weeks ago, where there's a huge excitement about that kind of expansion, given the massive congestion that exists on the I-45 corridor and the 5 million people that live along that front range. So we'll be deliberate. It'll be in consultation with states and communities to ensure that there's a level of ridership that will grow and can support those routes.
But you're not in a position right now to say whether or not that that will be self-sustaining, and that it would, or that it would indeed require a high degree of subsidization?
I'm not in a position to say that it'll be self-sustaining. I do believe that it would require support, but that support will be largely borne by the states because these routes are in the state-supported network. And so it's really, that's why we work closely with the states, because they've got to and sign up for that economic contribution.
I got you. All right. Thank you, Mr.
Now we will go to Mr. Moulton for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're learning a lot today, and it's a great hearing, so thank you so much for bringing it together. And Mr. Flynn, I just have a couple of questions for you. I've been a huge supporter of Amtrak for many years in Congress and beyond. Most recently led a bipartisan letter for Amtrak appropriations that would deliver nearly $4 billion for the Northeast Corridor of the national network, which was based on your estimated request released in early April. But I do want to get straight on some basic facts. What is the top speed of the Acela service?
The Acela service in the southern network, Washington to New York, top speed is 135 miles an hour. And then in New York to Boston, a top speed of 150 miles an hour across different segments of the track. We're operating at a lower speed on a scheduled basis, as most high-speed operations, in fact, do around the world.
So for how many minutes of the 7-hour journey from Boston to Washington does the Acela run at that top speed of 150 miles per hour?
It about 34 minutes would be the top, about 34 miles, pardon me, would be the top speed. We would be operating at that top speed over 34 miles of track.
So how long does that take? What's that, about 8 minutes or something like that? 10 minutes?
It's in that range. Yeah, it's in the range of 10 minutes, sir.
And so would the Acela's top speed of 150 miles per hour qualify as high-speed rail anywhere else in the world?
Yes, 125 miles an hour is the international standard for high-speed rail.
Actually, it's widely accepted to be 186 miles per hour. Usually the definition used in the European Union is about 160, 250 kilometers per hour, but 300 is really the standard. And of course, in China, China's building to much higher speeds, up to 250 miles per hour. Do you think that America should accept that lower standard, or should we be doing as well or as better than the Chinese?
Well, I think we should be providing America absolutely the best mobility options and strategy that we can. But I did want to say that as far as I understand the regulation, 125 miles an hour on existing track infrastructure is high speed. Our Acelas that we're ordering, the new Acelas that are delivering, I shouldn't say we've ordered, will have a top speed of 186 miles an hour. And with the infrastructure improvements we've talked about in our state of good repair, we'll be getting the Washington, for example, Washington, New York, down to 2 hours. That speed is an average of 113 miles an hour. But there's speeds, top speeds, and there's schedule speed. So for example, Tokyo, Nagoya, 35 million people in the greater Tokyo area, 12 million people in Nagoya. It's a 217-mile distance between the two. The version of the Shinkansens that ride on that track today have top speeds of 185 miles an hour, and the scheduled speed's 115, because there are stops in between. There's the time to ramp up. In fact, most of the international routes that I've examined since coming to Amtrak of high-speed trains in Europe and in Japan have schedules that operate somewhere between 49% to, I think, a high of about 70% of maximum speed.
Right, but Mr. Flynn, you're talking about average speed, right? Those lines in Japan still go 186 miles per hour. The trains still go 186. They just have to stay, because they have so many stops, their average speed is 115. And if you actually understand the history here, is that America revised down its definition of high-speed rail to make these other projects qualify. And I just don't understand why we wouldn't be aspiring to be the best in the world, rather than be behind literally everyone else when we talk about building a transportation technology.
We're not aspiring to be behind anyone, Congressman. Back in 2010 and 2012, we Amtrak provided the NEC Futures vision for the Northeast Corridor, which called for substantially higher speeds. It's really a question of funding.
Well, that is exactly I can assure you, Mr. Flynn, that is exactly the vision that I support, and I think you find a lot of support for that on the committee. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Next, we will have Mr. Davis for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to my colleagues and witnesses for being here today. Got a few questions. I'm going to try and run through them quick because I want to hit a few of you here who have come. Mr. Reininger, you're doing a lot of great work in Florida, Nevada, and California. First, is there any chance you're interested in a project connecting my home state of Illinois with any of its neighboring states?
Well, thank you, Congressman, for your question. And I guess we would have to go to our core business model and say, let's get out the map, let's draw a 300-mile ring around Springfield and find the major cities that connect in that ring, and let's find a road corridor or an infrastructure corridor that we can use as a jumping off point, and there's a solution hidden in there someplace. So we'd be happy to engage with you on that.
Great. I've ridden on your line in South Florida, and I'd be glad to sit down with you and your team at any time. Secondly, our former colleague and chair of the subcommittee, Jeff Denham, he would always use Brightline as a case study for the development of high-speed rail in the United States, as contrasted against the California experience that he saw. What have other countries done to successfully incentivize private sector investment, and what can we do better to spur private investment here in the United States?
So in our testimony, we've outlined a number of those things. I would say probably the most important thing that would boost private sector investment would be to help us access efficient long-term capital in one of any number of ways. So we've suggested that making private sector entities like ourselves eligible for grant programs in the future when we partner with otherwise eligible public sector entities is one way for the public sector dollar to be leveraged into more than $1's worth of outcome, right? And that would be an important way to make things happen more quickly. We've spoken specifically about expanding the private activity bond allocations. We used it effectively. It will help, but that alone isn't going to be the total solution to accessing capital because that capital market has simply limited overall liquidity within it to sort of help broad-based numbers of projects like these. We've also talked about utilizing low-cost loan programs like the RIF loan in a more efficient way, where it can actually be an incentive in the way that it was designed to be to get some of these projects over the economic hurdles that they face to become viable and self-sustaining of their own right. There could be other cooperative models that exist that parallel some of the things that we see elsewhere, where you have unified national host organizations that then tap into other providers such as ourselves that will offer returns on the public investments, but also carry the burden of some of the operations and maintenance risks that would otherwise have to be carried over the long term. So there are multiple sets of ways that access to the capital that gets projects over the hurdles that they presently face that would turn more of these conversations into reality.
Well, thank you, Mr. Reininger. I appreciate that. I do want you and the rest of the witnesses here to take a look at my One Federal Decision Act, because I know the regulatory environment can cause expansion, or it can cause a lack of expansion in capital products here in the rail industry and in passenger rail. Mr. Flynn, you know what I'm going to ask you about: the short shunt issue on the Saluki and Illini Express in central Illinois. What's the latest on getting the technology that we all know exists, that we've been told by Amtrak and by the CN that we just have to put it in the trains and it should fix it?
Good afternoon, Congressman Davis. It's great to see you again. We're continuing to work on that with the CN. We're experimenting with different types of cars, railway cars, that could address that shunt issue, and we'd be happy to come by and visit with you and give you some more detail on that.
I would. I told you guys last time, and I've said this to the CN too. my patience is wearing thin. We can't get, there's no way to talk about high-speed passenger service if we don't have reliability on the lines that we have now. And this one is abysmal. You guys know that it was long before you took over. I get it, but we got to get the technology. We've got to address this short shunt issue. Otherwise, a lot of technological advances that we're talking about here are going to either overcome the technology that Amtrak currently uses, or we're going to be able to work with Amtrak. So I do want to sit down with you, sit down with CN, and let's get this thing fixed before the next hearing so I can say thank you next time.
Well, we are testing a short shunt device now, and we will make it a point to come over or virtually brief, depending on what's allowed.
Thank you.
Come on by. I'd love to see you in person.
I'd like that too, sir.
I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and now it's my honor to recognize the gentlelady from Washington, the vice chair of the committee, Ms. Strickland.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As we've heard from multiple witnesses on our first panel, the need for federal investment in high-speed rail is clear, with the potential to create thousands of railroad and manufacturing jobs, save billions of dollars through reduced congestion on the roads. But I want to also point out that looking solely at high-speed rail doesn't necessarily solve every problem. We need a holistic framework that uses all types of modes of rail. So I'd like to start with you, Mr. Flynn. I'd like to touch on Amtrak's support for the development of new high-speed rail corridors and the role that the current service can play. So can you tell us, how can investments in conventional rail service complement investments in new high-speed rail lines like those being considered in my home state of Washington? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question, because the question itself really, from an Amtrak perspective, outlines the strategy for the development of high-speed rail corridors where they make sense across the country. If we look to learn lessons from the development in Europe and perhaps development in Japan as well, high-speed rail was developed in concert with conventional rail service and connected by two, often as we see on the Northeast Corridor, commuter rail service, so that there is a feed and a distribution to and from high-speed operations across those high-speed corridors. So we believe it absolutely is an integrated approach. And why in my remarks and in my written testimony that we've submitted to the committee, we've talked about not developing one-offs, but developing the integrated approach and building more reliable, higher speed conventional services at 110 miles an hour or approaching 125 miles an hour in new corridors or expanding current corridors with more frequency. We're building that passenger base. And certainly some of those corridors are and must be candidates for high-speed rail service. And that approach, that developmental approach, is really what we've seen in Japan, in Germany, in France, in Spain, really where we see successful high-speed rail.
Great. And then one other question about this topic. As the Biden administration and Congress pursue this aggressive agenda to mitigate climate change, in addition to obstacles around time frame, what do we lawmakers need to actually keep in mind on the interoperability between conventional rail and high-speed rail?
Well, I think one thing for us all to keep in mind is really time, the time dimension, because the president has set ambitious goals to achieve a 50% reduction by 2030. High-speed rail development, as I noted in my comments, at least the European Commission has identified it's a 16-year kind of development on average once the approvals are in place. That's after we have approvals. But we've pointed out in our Amtrak Connects Us corridor strategy, we can have impact now in the near term before 2030 to those environmental goals. So building out reliable, frequent conventional service is also the predicate to building at high speed where it's where it makes sense, if I can say it that way, and also is marching down the road to achieve those climate goals in the near term and sustain that.
Great. And then one more question while I have time still. You know, we talk a lot about equity, and that means affordability and access. So what are we going to be able to do to ensure that families at all income levels are going to be able to take advantage of these technologies, for example, in high-speed rail?
Thank you. Well, I'd like to just talk a little bit about Amtrak itself. We're a government corporation. 42% of Amtrak employees are ethnically diverse, and we have a long record of diversity in Amtrak employment, and we serve the cities. Our rail network serves the cities and often inner cities, and in many cities, the Amtrak services really are the only accessible inner city travel options that many people have. And so we are committed to equity in transportation. We think Amtrak has a demonstrated track record there, but we certainly have more to do, and we have a path to do that.
So I'm asking specifically about high-speed rail. Do you think there's a way for us to ensure that that's going to be accessible and affordable?
Yes, I do. In fact, I had a conversation with Chairman Payne about that several days ago. And if we think about our corridor in the Northeast, that certainly is accessible. Corridors in and out of a Chicago hub, for example, whether it's down into Illinois, into Missouri, across through to Michigan, building out higher speed services, the 110 to 125 mile services in many parts of the country where we simply do not serve today, I think absolutely do bring accessibility to good quality services that customers will want to take.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm out of time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Gentlelady yields back. Now we will have Mr. Fitzpatrick for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Flynn, thank you for attending this hearing today. The Northeast Corridor runs right through my district. SEPTA's commuter rail line is essential to my district. And I understand that the Northeast Corridor Commission has established a goal of switching from essentially a but-for liability provision and instead adopt a what's known as a no-fault liability provision so that each party takes responsibility for their own equipment, their own employees, and their own passengers. Currently, the but-for liability provision, we believe, unfairly penalizes SEPTA. No fault is already being used with most commuter rail lines across the NEC. So my first question is, when do you plan on abiding by the Commission's policy and adopt a no fault liability with SEPTA?
Thank you, sir, for the question. It's not my understanding that no fault is indeed the policy. There are in the Northeast corridor, the members of the Northeast corridor, the several states and Amtrak as well have different views on what the right approach should be on liability, and we're working to resolve that. Again, we'd be happy to sit down with you and your office and have a more fulsome discussion on the question.
Yeah, that's our understanding, sir, regarding the Northeast Corridor Commission and what they're establishing. So it's obviously very important to our districts. We'd appreciate the follow-up on that, sir, if that'd be okay. Next question, I'd like to ask you about Amtrak's last remaining in-house call center, which is right outside of my district. Many of my constituents, in fact, work there, and they provide superior customer service compared to the outsourced work. Yet this call center has continuously been under threat of outsourcing. So my final question for you, sir, will Amtrak consider ceasing its outsourcing of customer service jobs and support these hardworking women and men?
Yes, thank you for the question, Congressman. I don't believe that the call center is under constant threat. Some employees may feel that or may perceive that, but we've already made commitments to maintain the call center in effect, to maintain the work at the call center. And they've done just a great job. Everyone at that call center, along with all of our frontline employees, have done a great job of serving our Amtrak customers during this pandemic, and we've communicated that.
Well, I appreciate hearing that, sir, and I will communicate that to them. So you're opposed to outsourcing it?
We had, the company had implemented outsourcing, has a backup in peak demand periods, but we have made the commitment to that customer service center, and we will keep that commitment.
Thank you, sir.
Next, we will have Ms. Titus.
I just addressed my question to Mr. Reininger. You know, I'm a big fan of the project Brightline West. I've been working to try to get some kind of speed train, passenger train service between here and Los Angeles for many years. So I'm excited that it's coming. I think it'll bring more visitors to my district and help the economy during these difficult times, take cars off of I-15, improve air quality. But anytime we talk about infrastructure, we also have to focus on jobs. This is going to create some jobs and high quality jobs as you construct this project. So I would ask you, as you move closer to the construction phase, what are your relationships with labor? How are you talking to the workers who are both going to build this and operate it once it's finished?
Congresswoman, thank you very much for your question, and certainly thank you for all the support that you've provided us along the journey that we're underway with. You're exactly right. The investment that we're planning on making in Brightline West is going to create an enormous amount of job growth and activity in your area. Some 40,000 construction jobs we think will be generated by the investment that we're prepared to make there. With respect to labor, I think there'd be a couple of important points that I would make. First of all, we're in the midst of negotiations of construction contracts to be able to initiate the construction work that we just spoke of. And in the course of those negotiations, our preferred contractor is also in the midst of discussions with labor around a project labor agreement that would be put in place. Our understanding is from both sides that those discussions are going very, very well. We're very supportive of those discussions and anxious for that to come to an amicable conclusion. In addition, we made a recommendation as a part of the testimony here that private sector entities be allowed to be eligible applicants for some grant programs in the future. Without any specific regard to a particular idea, we put that forward as a general idea. But before we did that, we explored the idea with organized labor, and we have found them to be supportive of that proposed legislative action. And in fact, we've shared the correspondence that we've received from them with the railroad subcommittee staff here of this committee. So we've been engaged from the beginning here, and we understand the importance and the priorities that you're describing here. Lastly, I would tell you that our Florida operation, our first phase of our Florida operation, was built in complete compliance with the FRA's Buy America program, despite the fact that we didn't receive any federal funding that would have otherwise mandated those requirements. So we're respectful of and supportive of the sort of the initiatives that you're referring to.
That's great. You know, just to carry this a little further, you mentioned some things that we can do to better assist with the financing. You mentioned these grants. We talked about the bonds. Is there anything this subcommittee needs to be doing additionally to make that financing easier, to be sure this project gets underway sooner rather than later and we start to build back better?
Sure. I mean, the specific recommendations that we put on the table, you know, regarding eligibility for grants, the expansion of the PABS program, some revamping of the application of the loan programs are all going to be very direct, very actionable things that this subcommittee would be very helpful in. Beyond that, we've spoken on the written testimony about curtailing some of the discretion that is applied to some of the approval processes in the regulatory framework that will help otherwise increase confidence in the processes that we undergo, and also reduce what was oftentimes unnecessary time delays, which translate into additional costs to the project. So we have provided a few what we think are very actionable, very practical things that this subcommittee can do to help us do what we think we are doing, which is breaking the inertia that has limited progress in this space over the last several decades.
Well, I'm excited to hear that and work with you, Mr. Chairman, and the other members of this subcommittee. Representative Moulton, I know, is interested in this topic to try to get some of those things accomplished. I yield back.
Now we will have Mr. Westerman for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Crawford, and to all the witnesses. This is a very interesting testimony that I've listened to it and I've read your testimony, and probably a lot more questions than I can get in 5 minutes. But Mr. DeLeon, you testified that the development cost of Hyperloop is only $54 million per mile compared to $150 to $200 million per mile for other modes. Now, as an engineer serving in Congress, when I hear only $54 million a mile, that raises an eyebrow. And I even checked with my state Department of Transportation. They tell me they can build urban interstate for $9.7 million per mile, rural interstate for $7.5 million per mile, and interstate through the mountains for $11.45 million per mile. So would you clarify what you're talking about when you say only $54 million per mile, and what are the other modes that are 150 to 200 million?
Yeah, well, in all the analysis that we have done and in the analysis that we did in Great Lakes, this was the cost, the average cost that we would have, for developing all the infrastructure and all the system. Every time that we have done a comparison, we are looking at numbers that are around 30% to 40% less than high-speed rail. And that is because Hyperloop basically is a smaller infrastructure and much more simple infrastructure, okay? And, but of course, the cost of the high-speed rail depends also a lot in the country. In Spain was like 20 million per kilometer. In France was 32 million per kilometer. In California, they're talking about 150 million. So it depends on the country. So you cannot have a real clear cost, until you do a real feasibility study and you analyze the territory, the orography, and everything that is needed to develop. What we have seen in our Great Lakes feasibility study is that these numbers make a lot of sense, that you have a recap on the investment of around 25 years. Let me tell you.
I'm going to have to keep moving on, but I wanted to, Mr. Reininger, what's your experience on cost for high-speed rail? How much per mile?
So I can point to our two examples. Our real-world example in Florida, we've invested about $16 million a mile for the 235-mile system that we built there, and our Brightline West program is going to be executed for about $31 million a mile.
That still surprises me that it's that much per mile, but you built them, so you know exactly what it costs. As we look at new technologies like Hyperloop, I do see a lot of advantages for that, but I also understand that the technology is not as proven. But outside of that, what would prohibit? I mean, if you're looking at high-speed rail, why aren't you, or mass transit? Why wouldn't we be looking at Hyperloop as the first technology to look at, or the future technology? Mr. Aguilar, you might take a shot at that.
I would start by saying, short-term needs need short-term solutions. And as I said in my testimony, our market here down in Texas is already congested, very congested, needs solutions to be offered. Our cost per mile, by the way, is about $62 million a mile for the civil infrastructure. But that is because we have built a system that has 50% of this on viaduct. And this is to address concerns, to reduce impact on landowners and so on. But that's the main reason why.
Mr. Flynn.
Thank you, Congressman. Thank you, Congressman Westerman. From an Amtrak perspective, what we've talked about is investing really in both conventional and high-speed rail, which we have today on the Northeast Corridor. And we have the opportunity to expand higher speed conventional rail and high-speed rail in certain corridors in the U.S. Our corridors also serve commuter trains. And for example, if you look at our Northeast Corridor, there's 2,100 trains a day on that Northeast Corridor, and we're part of that. And that includes commuter rails as well, and in RSL, a high-speed train, and there's also 60 freight trains a day on that Northeast Corridor. So I think it's a very different, certainly a very different technology, and certainly very different application. And what we've talked about is the ability to enhance and expand and serve a greater part of America within the next decade on network that exists today that requires some upgrading, but certainly achievable in that time frame, with the benefits of mobility benefits, and I would argue the environmental benefits as well.
All right. Yeah, I knew I would have more questions than time. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
So at this time, I would like to recognize Representative Garcia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Strickland. Mr. Flynn, in your testimony, you laid out 4 corridors in Amtrak's national network that received significant investments from the 2009 American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, several of which run right through Chicago. Can you share with the committee what kind of further improvements we can anticipate with the type of investment proposed in President Biden's American Jobs Plan? And would Amtrak consider additional improvement in corridors that run through the Chicagoland area?
Let me start with the last part of your question as to whether Amtrak would consider additional investment. The answer is absolutely yes. And our Amtrak Connects Us strategy, which talks about new corridor services and expanded corridor services, it addresses exactly that. And certainly Chicago is a key component, a key node in the Amtrak network. So that's about expanding services from Chicago into Madison and Milwaukee. We're talking about expanding, that's our Hiawatha service, expanding to multiple daily services through to Minneapolis, St. Paul. To Congressman Davis, we're talking about expansions from Chicago into St. Louis on those several lines, the ability to connect to Detroit, Michigan, and points in between. So Chicago is a very important part of our network, as you know, and certainly a key part of our vision of how we can expand more rail services on routes that we have today and new passenger routes that we have yet to serve.
And you wrote at length in your written testimony about why the U.S. has fallen so far behind in high-speed rail connectivity. You also mentioned how existing funding programs like CRISI, the RAISE program, which we previously knew as the Tiger or BUILD, in your words, existing funding streams, quote, wouldn't even make a dent in the construction of a single high-speed rail line. What are some policy solutions the committee should consider to make sure an adequate source of funding exists to begin to build a framework for a high-speed rail network? And does intercity rail need its own dedicated funding stream?
Well, the answer to your question, Congressman Garcia, is in your statement. At the beginning of our hearing today, before the first panel spoke, Chairman DeFazio talked about funding, talked about the need for transportation infrastructure. One of the other witnesses, former Deputy Secretary Pocari, talked about funding and talked about the need for a trust fund structure or a trust fund-like structure so that we can have dedicated, predictable funding for these kinds of projects that are going to occur over a very long period of time. When we think about NEPA and the other permitting processes that take place, and then ultimately into construction, on many major projects, we're talking a decade or more. So without the visibility and the predictability and the certainty of funding, these projects are all affected. They ultimately become more high cost, and they take longer than they should. So if I were to recommend one policy action, creating a trust fund or trust fund-like structure for intercity passenger rail would be key.
Thank you. And finally, before our time runs out, you discussed the reduction in greenhouse gases when the Northeast Corridor was largely electrified. Are there other corridors in the country that would be strong candidates for electrification? What kind of market and policy obstacles remain in further electrification of our intercity passenger rail network?
Yeah, there certainly are other corridors that would lend themselves to electrification. There'll be requirements for density of service and key population centers. I talked earlier about our new intercity train sets that we have. We're placing an order for, finalizing that order. Those intercity train sets are dual mode, so the locomotive can go from electric to diesel, and a much more fuel efficient diesel in terms of greenhouse gas emissions that are created per passenger mile by those diesels. So there are interim steps that advance us along the president's goal to that 50% reduction in greenhouse gases. And passenger rail certainly is one of those vehicles to provide the mobility the country needs, but to do it in the most environmentally sustainable way. Thank you, sir.
Appreciate it. Well, certainly an interesting conversation today. I've had to dip in and out because of other things going on, but as a California member with the issue with high-speed rail in our own state, and I'll join some others in saying, look, I'm not against the concept, and I think the Northeast Corridor is our best chance for success on that and other areas, and as we look at them. But when I see where Texas is having a hard time, when Texas is having difficulty with their abilities to streamline and get through a process, how the heck is California going to do it at 50% higher prices for everything, a regulatory climate that is a lot more negative to doing it. And this is, you know, scored as an environmental project, and we still can't get very far with, as a state legislator, I was, you know, very interested in this and carried legislation on the high-speed rail project here, you know, trying to link LA and San Francisco with supposed spurs to Sacramento and San Diego as well. And it's fallen far short of what the voters were told when it was placed on the ballot for them to decide by a narrow margin, 52 to 48% years ago. And so legislation I had was, two of them was to say, stop spending until you have a plan, because they didn't have a plan for the route, how they're going to line up the property. They still don't have the property. And this is 12 years after it passed, and they're way behind on all their deadlines. Then later on, they told us, well, this is going to provide 1 million jobs. They sat there with a straight face and said 1 million jobs. Finally, we got them in committee a few years after, and they said, well, that means 1 million job years. Well, as the way it's going, it's starting to look like 1 million years, because they are so far behind, and the price is at least tripled. And I've heard in the earlier testimony, they're going to need many more billions of dollars from the federal government to continue going along. And so far, the federal government has committed to a total of about 3.3 billion under the Obama era ARA Act. And the state hasn't even put its own money forward. But so it just continues to be a frustration. So to hear a possibility of a high-speed rail line in California that might work, that Brightline is working on, the Los Angeles, Las Vegas route, that had been referred to as the Desert Express before, and some good work had got done towards that. But what I need to bring in as a question here to Mr. Reininger here is that I used to also chair back in 2016-18 in our Natural Resources Committee, the subcommittee on tribal affairs for the U.S. And so we have concerns there that the so far undefined routes through the area could be going through some burial areas and cultural sites of their ancestral lands that hasn't gone through what's known as a Section 106 review process. And so I want to hear from those on the panel that have an interest, especially Mr. Reininger. What can we do to allay this concern? Because I don't think you want to have the negative that's going to come from this later, and that we don't want to be doing things that aren't sensitive to taking care of those issues. Like up in my north part of the state, we've had levee repair processes that were important, but some of those go through old tribal sites and such, and there's people, that were buried there and such. But working with the tribes, they were able to, we took some elbowing of getting the Army Corps of Engineers to pay attention to that, but the tribes are very forward with us trying to say, hey, we want to help get this done, but we just need to have proper respect done for these old sites. Same thing here. What can we do better to allay some of the concerns of the tribes that are along the route there, and the cultural areas, the burial areas that might be, whatever it is, and get a proper review that doesn't take forever.
Rep. LaMalfa, we're going to run out of time here soon, so can we allow the panel to answer the question?
I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yep.
Thank you for the question, and I'll try to be as brief as I can, because I know the time is running out here. But clearly, we respect the process that's in place. The environmental review processes are well established. The kinds of investigations that are necessary are clear, and we're following those processes completely in everything that we're doing. The tribes involved here are definitely a stakeholder that would have a voice in the process, and we encourage the continued engagement with them to execute the process under the guidelines that are in place by the regulatory frameworks.
Well, it's seemingly not paying enough attention to Section 106 as it's titled, and they're not getting the results. So I don't think you want ultimately to go to some a worse outcome with, who knows, it could cause litigation, because it really hasn't been addressed from everything I've understood. So I think, and the FRA needs to be helpful on this too. So, but instead of just trying to push through on something that could cause legal issues or a lot of hard feelings later. So I'd look for a commitment to take a closer look at that.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.